This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and once again it's Smackdown time. This one came from you guys. A lot of you asked for this, so this is a Smackdown between the 15-inch MacBook Pro with Retina display 2015 latest edition model, the one with dedicated graphics we're going to use for this particular comparison, and we have the late 2015 Dell XPS 15, otherwise known as the Infinity Display XPS 15, because it has the near borderless display. We're using a high-end configuration for this too, and it's configured pretty much similarly to the Mac, and it costs around $2,100. So these are both high-end, very slim, light workstation class machines, and I know some of you just can't decide between the two, even though the Dell XPS is the one that's the new kid on the block. It has generational improvements that make it pretty exciting. There's a lot apparently that's appealing for the Mac too, so we're going to compare them now. Alright, so here we have a comparison between two absolutely lovely and very expensive machines. These are really geared towards those who are using these for work professionally. This is not something that would be wildly appropriate if you're just buying it to sit on the couch, surf the web, work on a Word document, all that sort of thing. Not that they can't do it, but they can do so much more, and the price tags tell us that. Now, first thing, it's not the fairest of comparisons, and at first I was hesitant to even do this because the MacBook Pro 15-inch with Retina display was last refreshed in June of 2015, and at that point Apple didn't update the processors, 4th generation Haswell, and that's what we're looking at right here today. That's because Broadwell wasn't quite available yet. Broadwell existed, the 5th generation processors, for like all of 2 months on the market. They disappeared, then Skylake came out. Now, the Dell is a very new refresh just last month. Skylake processors, also a redesign for Dell, some new ports, all sorts of new things here, whereas the Mac is pretty much, minor incremental updates. It would be interesting to see what Apple does next year with a 15-inch when they do come out with a Skylake machine. Now, one of the reasons it's taking them longer is because they don't just go with the regular level of Intel HD graphics, which would be the HD 530 that the Dell has. Switchable graphics here, we'll talk about that too. Apple always goes with Intel Iris Pro, which is the highest level of integrated graphics available for a serious performance boost over the basic HD graphics. That's not available yet from Intel. As to when Apple's going to refresh this one, who knows? It's sometime next year. That's all we can guess. They don't refresh their laptops that often. If they do it in less than a year, that's even kind of unusual. I mean, I would like to see it happen before June of 2016, but don't know. So with that preface in mind, and that's going to color some of the things that are going to be said here, let's get down to business. These are both pretty expensive machines. Now, I give kudos to Dell because, like a very large mainstream PC manufacturer, they offer it in a bunch of different configurations and prices. In fact, the XPS 15 is particularly flexible in terms of pricing. The cheapest one is $999. Now, you don't get all the goodies that you're going to want there, like an SSD or even a Core i7. It'll be a quad-core i5 there. No touchscreen, anything like that, but you can get into one if you just want the 15-inch display, the nice build quality, quad-core, that sort of stuff. You can do that. Apple, no, there's no bargain basement, no very base level configuration. The 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro is their high-line item. The cheaper one is $1,999, so $2,000. This time of year, you'll find it for like $100 off because it's holiday season 2015 now upon us. That has Intel Iris Pro graphics, and if you want the one with dedicated graphics, which is the AMD Radeon R9 M370X, that's going to be $2,500. You can find that on sale now for about $200 off. Good time of year to buy one of those too. So pretty darn expensive. Now with the Dell, like the one we have right here, is a pretty high-end model, so it goes for around $2,100. It's still a bit cheaper than the Mac, but that gets you switchable graphics. You still have the HD 530, but you also have NVIDIA GTX 960M dedicated graphics, 2 gigs of DDR5 VRAM. That's what the Mac has too in terms of VRAM, different AMD GPU obviously inside. You'll get the same 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage that you're getting in the Mac. So bringing them up to parity. And also this one has the 4K, otherwise known as UHD display, happens to be a touchscreen. There is a 1080p screen that's about $400 less without that, and that is not touchscreen. So given that the Mac is a very high resolution display, 2880 by 1800, I would go with the comparison with the 4K more than the 1080p, though for your practical uses you can decide what you want. Of course, 4K is even more pixels, 3840 by 2160. Can I tell the difference in terms of sharpness of text? No, not so much. They're both really very high resolution, and given that they are still laptops, they're probably going to be fairly close to your face, but not super duper close at 15 inches. equally as sharp. I can't say I prefer one over the other for text sharpness. Now, if you're doing graphics editing, which is one of the primary raison d'etre of both of these, video editing, graphics, Photoshop, Adobe Premiere, Final Cut Pro, whatever your favorite is, then you're going to have to zoom less to see more of the image on this, which is nice. So if you want to see your image at 50%, it's pretty easy to do if you have, say, a 16 megapixel digital SLR camera, whereas you might be having a somewhat lesser zoom ratio on your Mac. Still, both of them very good and very sharp. The 4K display here, I think you can see the difference in color saturation. This has 95% of Adobe RGB, wider color gamut than sRGB. The Mac covers 99% of sRGB, about 75% of Adobe RGB, so there is higher color saturation. Now, everything for the web is sRGB, and that's your goal. If you're doing something for print, or if you're actually working in professional cinema, then you're going to want the higher color gamut. So you know what it is you're going to be using these for and how useful it can be. I can tell you one thing about the Dell display. I love the rich colors no matter what you do. Even if you use Dell Premiere Color that's installed on this to try to get it down to sRGB, it's going to have more color saturation than just sRGB. You can't detune it that much. Also, it has a higher white point. That can be largely fixed with calibration, but that is a hardware aspect of the display. It's like 8500 Kelvin, where 6500 would be more desirable. So your whites are going to look bluer on the Dell no matter what. But again, with color calibration, like we're looking at the same TIFF file as a desktop image here, you can see that the whites are pretty close. So how about build quality, design, all that sort of stuff? Both of these are very light machines and very thin machines. You can see that the Mac is a little bit thinner, yeah, more than a little bit thinner, but still they're both very thin and light machines that are around 4.5 pounds, which is pretty amazing for unibody metal laptops that are 15-inch size. Both of these, part of the high price tag, comes from the, relatively speaking, miniaturization of components. The Dell XPS 15, this is the new redesign where they made it even smaller. We have that very narrow bezel here so they can bring down the size, and Dell says this is more the size of a 14-inch rather than a 15-inch. Since the Mac is very compact, the size difference in terms of footprint isn't very huge here. It's just a little bit, but it's a little bit smaller. You can see there it is, the difference in the size between the two of these. Of course, the Mac has a little bit of a taller screen, so that's also one of the things to consider. Both of these, very good construction, very rigid, no flex. Like I said, metal unibody. As to which you like better, that's up to you. I think, one of the challenges Apple's going to have for redesigning the 15-inch MacBook Pro is coming up with something that's even prettier. This really has aged well, and it's still like, wow, one of the nicest looking laptops on the market. And here we have two Thunderbolt 2/display ports, mini display ports right there. There's a magnetic charging connector. USB 3.0 port, we have two of those, one on each side. Our headphone jack. These display ports / Thunderbolt ports, well, if you're in the Mac land and you're using a Thunderbolt display, Thunderbolt's obviously useful. You can also get fast hard drive arrays and stuff like that, but the display ports are really handy for driving multiple displays. And I think most, especially graphics professionals, are probably using external high-resolution monitors that at least use DisplayPort. You're not going to be using HDMI so much, most likely. And if you have the model with dedicated graphics like we have here, you can drive a 5K display up to 60 hertz, which is a good refresh rate, and of course a 4K one as well if you want. If you're going with the integrated graphics, because this is a Haswell generation machine and Intel 4th generation graphics only supported 30 hertz for 4K for a refresh rate. So you might see a little ghosting on your mouse cursor, and it's less ideal if you're watching movies. And on the other side we have the SD card slot. Card will stick out part way as it does on the Dell. HDMI as well, and a second USB port, as I mentioned. Now the Dell, the redesign, we get some new ports with this, which is a pain in the in the short run, but it'll be a good thing in the long term. Here we have USB 3.0 port, we have HDMI port. HDMI can drive a 4K panel at 30 hertz. It is HDMI 1.2, not 2.0, so just like the Mac, there you're not going to get 60 hertz refresh rate out of this one. We have a USB-C / Thunderbolt 3 port here. That's awesomeness for the future. Awesome sauce, but not so much now. Why is that? Because this has no display ports. And again, if you're working in an environment where you've got display ports, the first thing you're going to do is scramble and try to find an adapter that gives you a display port out or HDMI 2.0 so you can have those nice 4K displays at 60 Hertz. So boy, I was running around looking at monitor price and everything because Dell's own adapters weren't available when this first came out, and you can find them. It's just a hunt. And now Dell does have a USB-C adapter, they call it, that actually offers an additional USB 3.0 port, HDMI 2.0, which has been a little bit flaky with Windows resolution scaling. Sometimes it forgets itself, and you got Ethernet on that. So things will be appearing. So that's what I mean. In the short term, you're going to be scrambling to find some cables, but in the long term, it'll all be good as more of that stuff is available. Usual headphone jack right there, and on this side, our other USB port for a total of 2, USB 3, and there's our SD card slot, and Dell's usual pokey things so you can see how much battery you have inside. So, unibody look, as to which you like better and as to how important looks are, that's up to you. On the interior, the Mac is finished with the usual matching metal. This one has Dell's nifty carbon fiber. I like that a lot. I think it looks good and feels good. It's very soft touch. Picks up some fingerprint oil, as does the trackpad. But before we get to the internals, though, upgradability, taking them apart, you know Macs just stink at that, don't they? The Dell, you need a Torx T5 screwdriver and a Phillips head screwdriver, and you can take off the bottom panel. Say you need to replace the battery somewhere down the road. There is a M.2 PCIe SSD slot in here. There, if you get the smaller battery, there's 2 battery sizes available. You might possibly, if you have the smaller battery, you'll have a 2.5-inch drive bay as well. The wireless card is socketed. It has 2 RAM slots. So both of these have 16 gigs of RAM, but with the Dell you have slots. So if you're one of those adventurous people who really needs a lot of memory, really hard to imagine needing 32 gigs on a laptop still, but I know it might be possible. Intelligent memory does make higher capacity DIMMs, so you could swap them out. The Mac, well, it's easier to service than an iPad, we'll give you that. But pentalobe screws on the bottom. You can take the bottom panel off. The battery is a multi-part assembly. You could replace that. The SSD is replaceable. RAM is soldered on board. So yeah, less upgradable there. But if you've already got 16 gigs of RAM and that floats your boat, that does the job, then cool. You can see we have ventilation on each side on the Mac over here, and we have an exhaust inside the hinge area. The Dell has a little bit more going on there. They went with the usual, just a whole line of ventilation right here. If you're using this on your lap, I can tell you from experience, try not to have your legs completely blocked. This if you're doing something like exporting 4K video in Premiere Pro. It likes to be able to breathe. With the Mac design, it's a little harder to block the vents because this curves away from you and it's kind of really pulling in from the side as much as it is from the bottom. So a little bit different there. In terms of who gets hot and noisy, they can be equally as loud. Neither of these has obnoxiously loud fans. Dell and Apple have different tuning going on here. Apple always likes to have the machine be quiet and have the fans come on as little as possible. Now, there are utilities to override that, and judiciously, you might want to make use of those. So with the Mac, if you're doing productivity work, streaming video, anything like that, you'll just probably never even hear the fan. It's going to be very quiet, and it stays very cool. It does not get hot. The only warm point is where the exhaust comes out here, and that's still below our body temperature, so it doesn't feel that hot. The Dell will have the fan kick on sooner. Occasionally, when you're just doing work, Word and, say, MS Office, surfing the web, stuff like that, you have the fan come on, go off. Not really loud or anything like that, but it just comes on, cools things. That's because Dell works hard to keep the CPUs running cooler at all times. That's not a bad thing for longevity of machines, so I don't have an issue with that. But you will hear the fans a bit more often. In terms of heat, this gets warmer right in this area over here, but it does not get burning hot ever, even again when exporting video in Premiere Pro. If you're playing Fallout 4 for an hour, it's going to get mighty toasty here, but it still doesn't ever really go above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you know, we're looking just a little over human body temperature. So both of these are pretty cool. Now, I can tell you one thing. When I was testing Premiere Pro on both of these, exporting video, 1080p video, high bit rate, the Dell fans came on, and both of these were plugged in, so we're going at maximum horsepower there and generating a little bit more heat. The Dell fan kicked on and it kept the CPU at 75 degrees centigrade, which is nice and safe. The ceiling is around 100 to 105 degrees on these CPUs. The Mac let it go all the way up to 90 before it kicked on the fans to max. Both of these also using their dedicated graphics, which didn't get that hot. So, yeah, wish Apple was a little bit more aggressive with their fan. But at any rate, it's generally speaking very quiet and cool to the touch, so what can you say? Keyboards and trackpads. Well, you know, Windows trackpads used to be not so great, right? Big changes here with the latest crop of Windows 10 machines, and Dell and Microsoft machines particularly have had really wonderful keyboards. Big, roomy glass touch trackpad here, supports multi-touch, 2-finger for right-click, that sort of thing. So just about as good as the Mac, if not as good. I really enjoy it. I don't have any complaints. It doesn't ever do any weird stuff. It just does what I want it to. It's good. Both of these have backlit keyboards, as you can see right here. Black with white, black with white. They're both very good. With the Dell, the letters light up. With the Mac, you get a halo of intentional light around each key as well. They're both very easy to see in the dark. It works out fine. They both have not a whole lot of key travel on them. And some people will prefer one keyboard or the other. I find them both very good. With the Dell, it took maybe an hour of getting adapted to the feel of the keyboard because of the short stroke. But once I did, liked it a lot. Mac keyboard, also very good. Operating system. Let's not forget operating system. Are you a Windows person or are you a Mac person? If you're a Mac person who's just tempted by the Dell because, boy, it has some nifty technology inside and it's thin and it's light, it's well made and all that kind of thing, that can be more challenging. I would say, for those of you who do know what operating system you prefer, let that be your guiding choice. With the Mac, you can install Windows on it, so you can have the best of both worlds. You don't really get control of your dedicated graphics anymore. It's always going to be running in dedicated graphics mode. Heat and battery life, not as good under Windows as they are on Mac OS. So I would say don't buy it to be primarily a Windows machine, the Mac. If you need to boot camp to use some Windows apps, some of the time you can do that. If Windows 10 is your thing and you're absolutely in love with it, and you've just always been curious about the Mac because, well, it's so frou-frou and people seem happy with it, hey, I get that. But if you really still want to spend most of your time in Windows, get the Dell. Related thing would be software. And, you know, most software these days, it doesn't really matter which you're using. You've got MS Office subscription-based. You've got Adobe CC apps subscription-based. A lot of work is done on the web these days using a web browser. So there's a lot of fluidity there. That said, I think a lot of people who do buy the 15-inch MacBook Pro are using a lot of the Pro apps, which is to say Adobe CC, maybe Final Cut Pro, probably not iMovie. You're probably using more like Final Cut Pro, aren't you? There are differences in performance, in part because Apple went with AMD graphics. Now, I think they did that because AMD could drive the 5K display, and like everybody else, I'm assuming there will be a 5K Thunderbolt display. Adobe has optimizations. They do support OpenCL and CUDA. OpenCL is an open standard for any graphics platform, and CUDA is an NVIDIA thing only. And the CUDA performance is stronger in Adobe apps. Now, if you're using Photoshop, even if you're using the spot removal tool on complex branches on trees and stuff like that, you're not going to really be able to tell the difference between the dedicated graphics model of each of these, honestly. But if you're using Premiere, we took the same 1080p high bitrate footage, 6 minutes of it, processed it on both of these, and the Dell was able to do it in 5 minutes while the Mac took 6 minutes. Apple drove the CPU temperatures higher during the export process too, as I mentioned, up to 90 degrees centigrade, where the Dell managed to keep it at 75 because it had that GPU doing more assistance. But if you are into Final Cut, then there is nothing like Final Cut. I'm not saying that I love it more than Premiere Pro, because I really don't, but when you're using it on Mac OS, the export times are about half or less. It's just astounding. And it's clearly Final Cut's very optimized for the AMD graphics. So that same 6-minute clip that I was talking about, that exported in about 1 minute and 40 seconds. And while we're on the subject of graphics, if you want to play games, if you want to play Battlefield 4, Fallout 4, Far Cry 4, everything's a 4 right now. Weird, huh? Anyway, I would certainly pick the Dell XPS 15. Apple doesn't build their laptops as gaming machines. Doesn't mean it can't play games, but it's not really designed for it in terms of cooling, in terms of the fact that you're really going to have to run Windows because there aren't as many game titles available natively on Mac OS, and a lot of them are kind of watered down. It's a shame. The 960M graphics in this, the NVIDIA GeForce, really awesome. The bee's knees. It's fun. You can play Fallout 4 in medium and high settings and have a great time gaming natively in Windows with Steam, with Origin, working great. Now, the Mac. It's not that the AMD graphics are so bad, but games are not as optimized for AMD right now, and AMD is not updating drivers constantly the way NVIDIA does just about every week, tweaking their drivers and getting ready for support for the latest games. So if you're a hardcore gamer, and I don't mean I want to play a game once in a while occasionally, Tomb Raider's fine with me, that sort of thing, Mac's going to be fine for you. But if gaming is a big part of what you want for your laptop, get the XPS 15. Battery life. You know the answer to this already, I bet, just because Macs have such a great reputation for battery life. Apple claims are around 9-10 hours of battery life, and we have the dedicated graphics model here. And in fact, I average 9 hours of battery life. That's doing productivity, streaming video, that sort of thing. I don't mean I'm editing video in Premiere Pro or going to town doing a bazillion RAW files on the road, although I'm doing some Photoshop image editing there with RAW files from a high-quality digital SLR. Gaming, we're not talking about that. Just normal use. Programming, that sort of thing, even doing some compiles. Yeah. The Dell, and again, we have the one with the bigger batteries, the 86 watt-hour battery, and the 4K display, which does use some more power, so the 1080p could potentially be better, although that's often paired with the smaller battery, so could level out. 6 hours or so on average, 6.5 hours sometimes doing the same task. So if you're going to be away from an outlet a lot of the time, nothing beats the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro for battery life. It's just insane for a machine with a quad-core CPU. Speaking of that quad-core CPU, like I said, Haswell generation, still 4th generation on our Macs. Skylake, 6th generation here. Both capable 45-watt quad-core CPUs. Benchmark-wise, the latest several generations of Intel CPUs really haven't been about increasing performance. They've been about reducing heat and increasing battery life and doing a better job with integrated graphics, which is somewhat less relevant when you're looking at machines that have dedicated graphics like these right here. So interestingly, on Geekbench, the older Mac actually scored a little bit higher. It scored 15,000 for the multi-core test versus 13,000 on the Dell. For Cinebench R15, the Mac with AMD graphics actually outscores the GTX 960M by about 15%, which is not insignificant. But if you look at most 3D Mark tests, which run under Windows, the 960M just owns it. The Dell does better there. So in terms of performance and horsepower, you see what I'm saying? It's pretty darn close there. 16 gigs of RAM, fast PCIe storage. Apple tunes better for their PCIe storage. They really get fast numbers. There have been growing pains with the new Skylake platform, the introduction of the new NVMe SSD drives plus Windows 10 in conjunction, and I think we're still not seeing as much performance as we could out of the fast SSDs in the Dell and also in some products like the Microsoft Surface Pro 4 and Surface Book. And that gets into reliability, stuff like that. Apple may not be the first with technology, but when they release something, it darn well works. Whether it's the Apple Pencil that works great or your new Mac, whatever new features it has, it's going to pretty be reliable. Windows is a little bit more like the wild, wild west, where you have the PC manufacturer making the hardware, Microsoft's making the OS, and there's third-party drivers, there's Intel drivers. The release of the XPS 15, the Surface Pro 4, the Surface Book, and a couple of other new Skylake machines just show the growing pains that can happen there. Intel display driver crashes, problems with going to sleep, connected standby, those sorts of things. Usually you won't see that so much with Apple. Granted, they have their OS a year for free policy, and there's some quirks that happen every time the new OS comes out, but sometimes things can get a little bit hairier. So Macs do have that reputation of you just buy it and it just works, and you know what? It's kind of true. In terms of support, you can go to any Apple store, and the people there are pretty nice, reasonably knowledgeable. They have Genius bars, and they have a customer knows what they're talking about kind of attitude. So that's really pretty nice. If you go in and you say X, Y, and Z is wrong, they're going to listen to you and they're going to believe you. With Dell, you'll call up Dell support. You can get their business support and their Premier support for a little better help. And you all know the joy of calling up Microsoft. If you've ever tried that for Windows support, it's pretty much scripted support. Not quite at the same level. So if that matters to you, if that level of hand-holding and support and that sort of thing is important, there you have it. Lastly, there's resale value. Macs have really high resale value. It's kind of crazy. Windows laptops, not as much, with some exceptions. Alienware, Microsoft Surface products. So if you're looking to get the most out of your laptop when you sell it 2 years from now, you'll probably get more for the Mac. So there you have it, the late 2015 edition Dell XPS 15, a fantastic machine, and the 15-inch MacBook Pro with Retina display, also a fantastic machine. Good in different ways. As always, it comes down to which OS would you prefer to run, primarily Mac or Windows. Next thing is going to be, are you a gamer? If you're a gamer, then it's the Dell XPS 15, I would say, for sure. If you're looking for some serious gaming time, I don't mean, once in a while you play some games, yada, yada. If you're really into gaming. If you're doing the pro apps, if you're particularly a person who uses Final Cut or iMovie, then the Mac obviously can shine there. Either one of these can run Microsoft services, sync to Google servers for your PIM information, all that other sort of stuff. Both are available with very lovely displays. Obviously with the Dell you can get that high gamut touch option. No touch screens on Macs. That said, in the 15-inch form factor, I don't find I use the touchscreen so much. I like it on smaller machines and tablets particularly. So a lot to consider there. Hopefully the points we've covered have helped you decide. On specs, on paper, just flat out, the Dell is going to win. But in actual use and as to which you prefer, again, for your operating system and what you do with the machine and battery life requirements, well, the Mac can do some strong points too. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to watch our video reviews of each of these products, read our written reviews, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.